When the judge handed her nothing but an old, dusty painting as part of her divorce settlement, Sarah thought it was just another cruel joke from her ex-husband. But when an art expert finally revealed its true value, she nearly collapsed on the spot. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will absolutely blow your mind. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, cutting through the tense silence like a gunshot. Sarah Hayes flinched at the sound, though she had been bracing herself for it. She had known this moment was coming, the official end of her marriage to Daniel, but the finality of it still rattled her bones. Across the room, Daniel sat perfectly composed in his navy suit, his jawline freshly shaved, his golden cufflinks glinting beneath the fluorescent lights. He looked like a man who had won, and in every sense, he had. He had the house, the car, the savings, the connections. His lawyers, sleek as wolves in their tailored suits, had carved through Sarah's modest claims with surgical precision, leaving her cornered and helpless. She had begged for fairness, pleaded for what was right, but justice had never been about fairness. In this courtroom, it was about power, and Daniel wielded it effortlessly. When the judge listed the final allocations, Sarah's chest tightened. Daniel's smirk widened with every line item that landed in his column. And then came the cruelest cut of all. The only item awarded to Mrs. Hayes, outside of child custody, is a painting, an oil-on canvas, found in the basement of the Hayes residence, said to be marital property with no current appraised value. The judge barely looked up from his notes. A painting. That was what her marriage of 12 years had boiled down to. A dusty old relic no one had cared about, not even Daniel, until now, when it became the final nail in her humiliation. Daniel's eyes flicked to hers, gleaming with quiet triumph. His smirk was an insult that needed no words. He had orchestrated this. He had wanted her to walk away not only with nothing, but with a symbol of that nothing. A cracked, faded canvas, one he had mocked in the past, calling it basement junk. Now it was hers, stamped and sealed by the court. Sarah swallowed hard, clutching her hands together in her lap to keep them from shaking. She should have felt anger, maybe bitterness, but what surprised her was the surge of heat rising in her chest, not of defeat, but of defiance. She refused to give Daniel the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She lifted her chin, her expression cold, even as her heart pounded. When the session ended, Sarah walked out of the courtroom with the painting tucked under her arm. The frame was chipped, the varnish yellowed, the pastoral scene dull under decades of dust. She wanted to throw it in Daniel's smug face, to splinter the wood against his polished shoes. Instead, she clutched it tightly, her nails digging into the rough edges of the frame, as if it were the only anchor left tethering her to herself. Daniel strolled past her with his lawyer, his cologne trailing like arrogance in the air. "Enjoy your masterpiece," he whispered, low enough that only she could hear. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. She stepped into the crisp air outside the courthouse, her breath forming in pale clouds. The world felt different, as though the sky itself had tilted and left her standing on a slant she wasn't prepared to balance on. Reporters clustered near the steps, cameras flashing for another high-profile divorce where money, property, and power had dictated the outcome. But Sarah was invisible to them. She wasn't the story. She never had been. She walked quickly down the steps, the painting pressed against her chest like a shield. People brushed past her without notice, their eyes fixed on Daniel, who climbed into a sleek black car waiting at the curb. The door shut with a solid thunk, and just like that, he was gone, whisked away into his world of influence, untouchable as ever. Sarah's cab didn't come. She hadn't even ordered one. She walked instead, each step heavier than the last, her future folding in on itself with every block. In the cab of a passing delivery truck, the driver glanced at her, a woman clutching a battered painting, her face pale, her hair whipping in the winter wind. He didn't know what she carried wasn't just a painting, but the ashes of a life she had thought was permanent. She held it like it mattered, because she needed something, anything, to matter. Back in her apartment, the silence greeted her like a void. She leaned the painting against the wall by the door, too exhausted to look at it. The cracked edges caught the light, reminding her it existed, mocking her with its presence. She collapsed on the couch, burying her face in her hands. Her life had been reduced to this: a child custody agreement, a mountain of bills, and a worthless relic her ex-husband had pushed into her hands like an insult. Yet she hadn't let it go. Somewhere deep in her chest, under the weight of grief and anger, something told her not to. Something whispered that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something else entirely. In her small rented apartment, the painting leaned against the peeling wall like a silent judge. Sarah tried to ignore it as she sifted through unpaid bills scattered across the kitchen table. The electric company's red notice screamed at her. The landlord's warning was taped crookedly on the door, demanding rent she didn't have. And then there was the pharmacy receipt. The cost of Liam's inhalers, barely covered by her minimal insurance, was more than she had left in her account. She pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to hold the weight of everything together, but the pressure only grew heavier. Liam played quietly in the bedroom, his cough echoing every few minutes like a cruel reminder of what was at stake. Sarah glanced at the clock. She'd need to get to her evening shift at the diner soon, but she didn't have the energy. Her legs felt like stone, her chest hollowed out by defeat. She had been someone once: a wife, a partner in Daniel's empire, a mother with stability. Now she was scraping coins from the couch cushions to buy milk. She turned her eyes toward the painting, its muted pastoral scene mocking her. The rolling hills, the small cottage, the faint outline of a woman with a basket, it all looked like a postcard from a life she'd never have. Cracked varnish and chipped frame, it was as broken as she felt. More than once she thought of hauling it to the dumpster behind the building. Let the garbage truck carry it away. But every time she reached for it, something stopped her. Her grandmother's voice whispered from memory, "Don't throw away history, even if you don't understand it yet." Her grandmother had believed that objects carried stories, that everything was connected to a bigger picture. Sarah wasn't sure she believed it, but the words clung to her anyway. At night, when the apartment grew quiet and the streetlights cast yellow shadows through the blinds, Sarah sat at the table, with her head in her hands. She thought of Daniel's smirk, of the courtroom, of the cruel satisfaction in his eyes as she carried away the only thing she'd been allowed to keep. He thought he'd broken her. Maybe he had. But the painting stayed, unwanted but immovable, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust. The days blurred into each other. Sarah applied for jobs during the mornings, got rejection emails in the afternoons, and trudged to the diner at night. She forced smiles for customers, carried trays until her arms ached, and returned home to the soft coughs of her son. Every time she opened the door, the painting was there. Silent, watching. She started to notice little things. The woman in the painting, who at first seemed like nothing more than a brushstroke figure, looked sad. Almost too sad. Sarah found herself staring back at her, wondering what story lay behind those painted eyes. Then she noticed the faint initials near the bottom, barely visible, as though time itself had tried to erase them. E.V. She traced them with her fingertip, her heart unexpectedly quickening. For the first time in months, something pierced through her exhaustion a flicker of curiosity. What if this painting wasn't junk at all? What if Daniel, in his arrogance, had tossed away something more valuable than he could imagine? Sarah sat back, the weight of the thought pressing into her. She didn't know yet that she had been handed not an insult, but a lifeline. She didn't know that this cracked canvas would drag her out of despair and thrust her into a world of secrets, danger, and possibility. But she could feel it, faint and insistent, in the pit of her stomach. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. It was Liam who noticed first. Rain drummed steadily against the windows that evening, filling their small apartment with a soft, relentless rhythm. Sarah was in the kitchen folding laundry, her body moving on autopilot after another grueling day at the diner. She barely noticed that Liam had gone quiet until she peeked into the living room and saw him crouched in front of the painting. His small frame was hunched, his hands resting on his knees, his head tilted to the side the way he always did when something captured his attention. For a moment, She thought he was simply lost in his imagination, the way children sometimes were, spinning stories out of shadows and shapes. But when he looked up at her, his dark eyes serious, his voice carried a weight unusual for a boy his age. "Mom," he said softly, "the lady looks sad." Sarah blinked. "The lady?" She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked over, kneeling beside him. Her eyes traced the muted colors, the dull browns and fading greens of the pastoral scene she had long dismissed as meaningless. It was true there was a woman in the painting, tiny in scale, nearly lost in the sweep of brushstrokes that formed the background. She carried a basket, her form blurred with time and neglect, but her face, though no bigger than the tip of Sarah's thumb, seemed hauntingly expressive. The sorrow etched into her painted features was undeniable once you saw it. Sarah leaned closer, her breath fogging the cracked varnish, and for the first time she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the apartment walls. "How did I miss that?" she murmured. Liam shrugged, his finger pointing toward the lower corner of the canvas. "What's that?" She followed his gesture and froze. There, barely visible beneath the grime and age, were two faint letters etched into the paint. E.V. Sarah's heart skipped. She had never noticed them before, not through the haze of exhaustion or the fog of her grief. Could it be the artist's signature? Her fingers, trembling slightly, reached out to brush against the surface. She stopped herself at the last second, afraid she might damage it. Instead, she let her eyes linger, tracing the delicate letters, her mind sparking with questions she didn't yet have the energy to form. The initials seemed to hum with quiet importance, as though they were waiting for someone to notice them. Liam looked at her expectantly, sensing the shift in her expression. "Does it mean something, Mom?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Maybe." The word hung in the air between them, fragile but electric. It wasn't certainty, but it was possibility, and that was more than she had felt in months. A ripple of curiosity stirred within her exhaustion, small but insistent. Maybe the painting wasn't junk after all. Maybe it was something else, something bigger, something Daniel hadn't even realized when he'd sneered and shoved it into her hands like a final insult. She stood slowly, her knees aching from the cold floor. The room looked different now, though nothing had changed except her awareness. The painting leaned silently against the wall, the woman's sad eyes following her as though they carried a story she was meant to uncover. Sarah pressed her hand to her chest, steadying her breath. "Come on," she said gently to Liam. "It's late. Let's get you ready for bed." But long after he had drifted to sleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the painting through the doorway. The initials burned in her mind, impossible to ignore. For the first time since the divorce, a spark of something unfamiliar flickered in her veins. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was close. She didn't yet understand what she had, but she knew one thing: it wasn't worthless. Not anymore. Desperation, however, has a way of smothering curiosity. By the end of the week, the bills had piled higher, the refrigerator was nearly empty, and Liam's cough had returned with sharp insistence. Sarah looked at the painting, her jaw tight, her chest aching with guilt. She couldn't afford the luxury of mystery. She needed money, and she needed it now. On a gray morning, she wrapped the painting in an old sheet and lugged it through the biting wind to a pawnshop a few blocks away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of metal and dust. Rows of forgotten lives lined the shelves, guitars with broken strings, mismatched china sets, tarnished watches, electronics stacked like tired soldiers. The man behind the counter was heavyset, his eyes dulled from years of appraising desperation. Sarah laid the painting on the counter, her palms damp with sweat. For a moment, she let herself imagine he would look at it and gasp, recognizing its worth instantly. She pictured herself walking out with enough cash to cover the rent, the groceries, the medication, and maybe even a small treat for Liam. The man glanced at it once, didn't even bother lifting it. He smirked. $20. The words hit her like a slap. $20 for the last scrap of her old life, the one thing Daniel had left her with? Her cheeks flamed hot, her throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. "20?" she echoed, her voice trembling with disbelief. The man shrugged, already reaching for a form. "That's what it's worth to me. You want it or not? He tapped the counter impatiently, his eyes sliding past her to the man waiting in line behind her with a set of golf clubs. To him, the painting was nothing but another piece of clutter, no different from the broken lamps or chipped jewelry that passed through his hands every day. Sarah's hands curled into fists. Every part of her screamed to take the money, to do something practical. But another voice rose up, small but fierce. Don't let him. Don't let anyone strip this from you. She thought of Liam's serious face, of the sadness he had seen in the painted woman's eyes, of the faint initials glowing like a secret waiting to be told. She shook her head. No, she whispered. Then louder. No, I'll keep it. The clerk rolled his eyes. Suit yourself. She grabbed the painting back, clutching it against her chest as though it were a child. The man behind her muttered something impatient, but she didn't care. She pushed through the door into the icy wind, her eyes stinging with tears. The cold air slapped her cheeks, making the humiliation sharper, but underneath the shame was something else. She felt foolish, dragging around what was likely worthless junk. Yet she also felt strangely protective, as though she had just defended something important. The sheet flapped in the wind, and she adjusted her grip, holding the canvas closer. On the walk home, she passed people rushing with bags of groceries, couples huddled under umbrellas, children skipping through puddles. She wondered what they saw when they looked at her, a tired woman, clutching a painting like it mattered, when everyone knew it didn't. But deep inside, something whispered otherwise. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this canvas than the world or Daniel believed. By the time she reached her apartment, her arms ached and her hair was plastered to her forehead by the rain. She set the painting back against the wall, dripping with cold, her breath ragged. She hated it, and she cherished it all at once. She sank onto the couch, hugging her knees, staring at the faintly visible initials in the corner. E.V., she whispered to herself. The letters pulsed in her mind, insistent, unshakable. She didn't know yet what they meant, but she knew one thing with certainty. She wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. The library had always been a sanctuary for Sarah, a quiet refuge where the world's noise could be traded for the silence of paper and ink. She pushed open the heavy glass doors that morning, clutching her phone with the photo of the painting open on the screen. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that the initials meant nothing, that she was clinging to a fantasy because her reality was too grim to bear. But the pull of those faint letters wouldn't let her rest. They echoed in her head as she passed the rows of shelves and breathed in the familiar scent of old bindings and dust. Mrs. Holloway was behind the desk, her small round glasses perched low on her nose, her hair pinned into the same bun Sarah had seen since childhood. The librarian had been a constant presence through the years at school projects, summer reading contests, and later when Sarah brought Liam for story hour. She had always been kind, the sort of woman who spoke softly, but carried a quiet authority, as though the walls of books had entrusted her with their secrets. "Mrs. Holloway," Sarah began, her voice hesitant, "can I show you something?" The older woman looked up, smiling faintly at the sight of her. "Sarah Hayes, it's been too long. What is it, dear?" Sarah hesitated before handing over her phone. On the screen was the photo she'd taken of the painting propped against her apartment wall. The muted colors, the faded pastoral scene, the tiny, sorrowful woman. It all looked as ordinary on the phone as it did in person, but Sarah couldn't shake the urgency clawing at her. Mrs. Holloway adjusted her glasses and leaned closer, studying the brushstrokes with surprising intensity. Her brow furrowed. She tilted the phone, her eyes narrowing, as if she could see past the cracked varnish and grime into the artist's hand itself. "My word," she whispered almost to herself. The tone in her voice made Sarah's pulse quicken. "What?" Sarah pressed. "Do you recognize it?" The librarian didn't answer immediately. Instead, she set the phone down carefully on the counter and shuffled toward the reference section. She moved with purpose, pulling down a thick volume from a shelf that looked untouched by most patrons. She carried it back and opened it with reverence, the pages yellowing and smelling of time. Her thin fingers flipped deliberately until she stopped at a grainy, black and white image. "There," she said, tapping the page. Sarah leaned over, her heart pounding. The photo showed a similar style, the brushwork hauntingly close to what hung in her apartment. Though faded and blurred, the strokes carried the same depth, the same moody atmosphere. Beneath the picture, the caption read, Elena Volkov, 19th-century Russian émigré painter, works largely lost or destroyed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Elena Volkov? She repeated, her voice shaking. She looked back at her phone, at the initials etched faintly in the corner of her painting, E.V. Mrs. Holloway nodded slowly, her expression grave. Yes. If what you have is genuine, Sarah, it could be extremely valuable. Volkov's works were thought to be nearly all lost. Fires, wars, theft history was not kind to her legacy. Sarah gripped the edge of the counter, her knees suddenly weak. Valuable? She echoed, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. The librarian's gaze hardened, her voice dropping to a warning tone. But you must be careful. Discoveries like this don't just attract museums and historians. They attract opportunists, people who see dollar signs, not art. And people like that, they can be dangerous. The words chilled Sarah more than the drafty air in the library. She felt the weight of them pressing on her chest, mingling with the faint thrill of hope that had begun to spark. Dangerous, valuable. Her mind whirled. She imagined Daniel's smirk if he ever found out, imagined him storming back into her life, demanding what he'd once scorned. She imagined strangers sniffing around, eyes gleaming with greed. Are you saying it could be worth... Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Holloway pressed her lips together, closing the book gently. I can't say. That's for experts to determine. But if it is truly a Volkov, you may be holding more than just a painting. You may be holding a piece of history. Treat it as such. Sarah nodded, her throat dry. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her fingers trembling. As she left the library, her footsteps echoed louder than usual across the polished floor. The glass doors closed behind her, shutting her out into the crisp air. She hugged herself tightly, her whole body shaking. For the first time, the painting in her living room didn't feel like an insult, didn't feel like Daniel's cruel joke. It felt alive, humming with a history she didn't yet understand, vibrating with secrets that had survived wars, fires, and decades of silence. She walked home trembling, the world around her sharper, more dangerous, more full of possibility. Sarah couldn't let it go. That night she sat staring at the painting for hours, her eyes drawn again and again to the faint initials at the bottom. Elena Volkov. The name pulsed in her mind like a drumbeat. She searched her phone for information, scrolling through fragmented articles and scattered references to an artist whose life had been marked by exile and tragedy. There were whispers of brilliance, of works lost in flames, of rumors that a handful had survived in private collections. But her search brought more questions than answers. She needed someone who could see what she couldn't. Someone who could tell her if this was fantasy or truth. By morning, her decision was made. She called the local community college, asking nervously if any of the art professors might be willing to look at a painting. The receptionist gave her a name, Dr. Adrian Wells. His reputation was eccentric, his classes half empty because he rambled. But those who cared about art spoke of him as brilliant, a man who lived and breathed the canvas. Sarah dialed his office number, her heart pounding. The line crackled, and then a warm but distracted voice answered. She explained haltingly about the painting, about the initials, about her curiosity. She sent him the photo while they spoke. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then his tone shifted. "This could be extraordinary," he murmured. Sarah's chest tightened. "Extraordinary? Bring it in," he insisted. "I need to see it in person. Don't clean it, don't alter it, don't even dust it. Just bring it." Nervous but trembling with hope, Sarah wrapped the painting in blankets and carried it across town. Every step felt weighted, as if she were carrying something far larger than its frame. Her arms ached, her breath came fast, but she couldn't stop. Dr. Wells met her in a cluttered office lined with books and sketches. His hair was wild, his fingers stained with ink, his tie hanging loosely from his neck. He cleared a space under a lamp, his movements brisk but reverent as she unwrapped the painting. When the canvas was revealed, he inhaled sharply. He slid on gloves and leaned in, tilting the lamp until the light caught the brushstrokes. He didn't speak at first, only traced the edges with careful fingers, examining the texture, the layering of paint. His eyes lit with something like awe. "The technique," he finally said. "The brushwork. It's consistent with Volkov. The mood, the palette, even the sorrow in the figure's face. It all speaks to her hand." Sarah's knees weakened, and she gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "But," he continued, "we'd need verification from a certified appraiser, someone with authority to authenticate." He looked up at her, his eyes sharp now, his voice steady. "If this is real, Sarah, you may be holding one of only a handful of Volkov's works that survived. Her legacy was thought lost in a fire in St. Petersburg in 1912. But if this survived—" Her breath caught. She felt dizzy, as though the room had tilted beneath her feet. For the first time in years, she tasted hope, not just a flicker, but a flood that filled her chest and made her pulse race. She had walked into the college, carrying what she thought was a relic of humiliation, and walked out knowing she might be holding a miracle. The gallery smelled faintly of varnish and old wood, the kind of place that carried both reverence and intimidation in its polished silence. Sarah perched on the edge of a leather chair, her hands gripping the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles whitened. Across the room, Eleanor Grant moved like a surgeon preparing for an operation, laying out her tools with a precision that made Sarah's heart thud in her chest. A magnifying glass, a small ultraviolet lamp, a pair of cotton gloves. Eleanor had a reputation for cutting through fantasy with brutal honesty. Collectors trusted her, artists feared her, and clients came to her for truth, even when they didn't want it. The painting rested under the bright gallery lights, every flaw exposed. Sarah wanted to shield it, to keep it away from the judgment of those sharp eyes, but she knew she couldn't. She had asked for this. She needed this. Minutes passed in silence as Eleanor bent close, her magnifying glass hovering over the initials at the bottom corner, her eyes narrowed. She studied the cracked varnish, the faded hues, the tiny woman with her basket, whose sadness seemed more alive than paint should allow. Sarah's palms grew clammy, her heart hammering in her ears. Finally, Eleanor straightened, exhaling softly, and removed her gloves. "Miss Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the gravity of a verdict, "I believe you've been sitting on a masterpiece." The words landed like a blow and a blessing all at once. Sarah's mouth went dry, her breath catching in her throat. She leaned forward, searching Eleanor's face for any sign of doubt, of jest, but the appraiser's expression was steady, grave. "Masterpiece?" Sarah whispered. Eleanor nodded, her gaze returning to the painting with something close to awe. The pigments match those used in late 19th century Russia. The layering technique is unmistakable. And the initials, though faint, are consistent with the signature found on Volkov's surviving sketches. It's rare, Miss Hayes. Very rare. If authenticated by a panel, its value could range anywhere from $2 million to $5 million. The room tilted around Sarah. Her vision blurred as she tried to process the words. Millions, not hundreds, not thousands, millions. The painting Daniel had mocked her with, the one he had shoved into her hands like trash, was worth more than everything he had stripped from her combined. Her hands trembled violently as she clutched the armrests of the chair. "You're sure?" Eleanor's eyes met hers. "Very sure. And this changes everything." The certainty in her tone left no room for doubt. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, her pulse racing, her thoughts spinning. She thought of Liam, of the night she sat in the dim light, counting pennies for his medicine. She thought of the eviction notices, the rejection letters, the weight of hopelessness crushing her chest. And now this. A door she hadn't known existed had swung open, revealing a future she hadn't dared to imagine. When she finally rose to her feet, the painting tucked back under her arm, her legs felt unsteady, as though she were learning to walk again. Eleanor pressed a card into her hand, her expression serious. "Keep this safe. Tell no one, not yet. News like this travels fast, and not everyone will have your best interests in mind. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Outside the sun was glaring, the street noisy with traffic, but Sarah moved as if in a dream. She wanted to laugh, to scream, to run back to the courthouse and slam the appraisal in Daniel's smug face. She wanted to show him that the scrap he had mocked her with was worth more than every brick of his empire. But Eleanor's words echoed in her mind like a warning bell. Not everyone will have your best interests in mind. She held the canvas closer, her fingers digging into the frame as if it might be ripped away from her at any moment. The world suddenly felt sharper, full of hidden eyes. And as she walked down the street, she realized with a jolt that life would never be the same again. She left the gallery in shock, clutching the painting like a lifeline, her breath uneven. The city hummed around her, cars rushing past, people moving in waves, but Sarah felt separated, caught in the fragile bubble of her secret. The canvas under her arm was no longer a burden, no longer an insult. It was salvation. It was danger. She kept hearing Eleanor's warning as she walked. "Keep this safe. Tell no one." The words looped in her head, warring with the urge to shout her triumph to the world. She imagined barging into Daniel's office, slamming the painting on his desk, watching his smug smile collapse into shock as she revealed what he had thrown away. But even as the fantasy warmed her, her gut twisted. This was no time for pride. This was survival. At the curb outside the gallery, a man lingered. His coat collar was turned up against the wind, his hands shoved into his pockets. Sarah might not have noticed him if not for the way his gaze flicked, quick and sharp, to the painting in her arms. Their eyes met briefly, and though he looked away just as fast, her instincts screamed. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding as though she had sprinted. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. By the time she reached her building, her nerves were raw. She locked the apartment door behind her and leaned against it, her breath ragged. Liam's laughter drifted from the bedroom where he was building a tower of blocks, blissfully unaware of the storm raging in his mother's chest. She forced herself to smile when she peeked in, ruffling his hair, but the weight of the secret pressed harder. She dragged the painting into her bedroom and shoved it into the closet, burying it under old blankets and boxes of clothes. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the lumpy pile, her chest tight. It didn't feel safe enough, but it was all she had. That night, sleep was a stranger. Every creak of the old pipes, every groan of the building settling made her jolt awake. She lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the night, her body taut with fear. At one point, she thought she heard footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate. She clutched Liam closer, pressing her forehead to his, whispering promises she hadn't dared speak before. "I'll keep you safe," she murmured. "I'll make this better. I promise." For the first time, those promises felt possible. For the first time, the future didn't look like an endless corridor of struggle and loss. But possibility carried weight, and with it came peril. The painting had given her a glimpse of freedom, but it had also painted a target on her back. She lay awake until dawn, her eyes fixed on the closet door where the masterpiece hid under its makeshift shroud. The first light of morning spilled through the blinds, gilding the edges of the cracked varnish she could still see in her mind. Salvation or curse, she couldn't yet decide. All she knew was that life had shifted, and nothing could go back to what it was before. The email arrived like a cold slap in the middle of a humid afternoon, terse, clinical, and small enough to be swallowed by the endless spam in Sarah's inbox, except for the sender, Daniel. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard as if contact might burn. The subject line read, "I hear you're sitting on something valuable. Don't get too comfortable, it should have been mine." The message beneath was shorter still, a line barbed with entitlement. "You made your choices, Sarah. Don't expect me to let this go. Consider this your first and only warning." Her stomach dropped so low it felt as if it had tried to crawl out through her feet. For a moment she sat paralyzed, the memory of the judge's gavel snapping through the courtroom like the crack of a whip. Daniel had been calculating then. He'd used his money and lawyers the way other people used keys and coffee. He'd taken the house, the cars, the accounts, the trophies of their life, and left her with a child, a stack of unpaid bills, and the one thing he'd thought was worthless. Now he wanted the painting, retrospectively recognizing what she already knew. Value could sleep in the cheapest of things until someone shook it awake. She called Eleanor, hands trembling so much she nearly dropped the phone. The appraiser's voice was cool, practiced. "Daniel is resourceful," Eleanor said. "He might be testing the waters, seeing whether you'll cave. Or worse, trying to build a paper trail to show you withheld assets." Sarah's chest tightened. The words made the scenario real in a new and dangerous way. If Daniel tried to reopen the divorce under claims of fraudulent omission, he could force a legal battle that she didn't have the money to fight. Within hours, his lawyer's voice came through, on the line like a polished blade. "We're looking into a potential claim of fraudulent omission," he said, his tone sympathetic enough to be infuriating. "You should consult counsel." The implication sat heavy. "Hand over the painting, or we'll tie you in court so long you'll beg to settle." Sarah snapped the phone closed, sudden rage flushing through her that felt almost as powerful as the fear. How dare he? He'd tossed the canvas into the divorce as a taunt. He'd made a mockery of her pain. And now, because the world had recognized value in a few layers of oil and varnish, he wanted to reclaim what he had decided was his. She thought of Liam, the small body curled against the pillow, the way he pressed his face to her neck when storms frightened him. She thought of the eviction notice, the rent due that had grown like a dark tide under her feet. She thought of the nights she had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Daniel leave for work with his tailored coat and coffee cup, and how impotent she had felt watching their life disassembled. This painting was a ticket out, a way to unbind the weight strapped across her and her son. She couldn't let him take it back. Panic like an animal moved under her skin, but beneath the panic came resolve. She called Dr. Wells, the eccentric professor who had first suggested Volkov's authorship and then quietly lit a match under her hopes. Adrian answered in that distracted, brilliant way he had, like someone always on the verge of discovery. He listened as Sarah explained the email, the lawyer, the threat. "We'll need to document everything," he said, "and you mustn't let it be handled casually. This is no longer just art. It's evidence and property, and potentially a dangerous magnet." Adrian's suggestion was practical and immediate. Get a lawyer who would file a declaration of possession, start a paper trail proving you've had it under your care since the divorce, and meanwhile move it to secure storage. He emphasized discretion. "You don't shout about a winning lottery ticket in a row house," he said. "You keep your head down and your prize in a lockbox." But the idea of putting the painting in storage felt strangely final. It was the same impulse she'd had at the pawn shop: give it away, throw it out, wash her hands. Only now she knew the price. Now it was gold. Now it was a lit fuse. She thought of Eleanor's warning to keep it secret. If Daniel had found out so quickly, then the knowledge was getting around in circles that both terrified and intrigued her. How had the news reached him? Was it a leak from the gallery? A comment from someone at the appraiser's office? Or had someone noticed her carrying the canvas? The questions multiplied and hurt. That night she cleared out a shoebox under her bed, digging for the little things that gave a life shape: Liam's old wristwatch with broken straps, a stack of school photos, a handful of library cards. She packed a change of clothes, important documents, the lease, the divorce papers, and slipped them into a bag. She did the practical things like a woman who had learned to survive by planning. She photocopied the appraisal receipt, scanned it, and sent a backup to Dr. Wells, and typed up an inventory of the painting's provenance based on what Mrs. Holloway had found at the library. When Liam asked if she was okay, she smiled until her face hurt and told him a half-truth. "We're going to fix things, little one," she said. "Soon." He nodded as if he understood, then shoved a toy truck under the bed and demanded she fix its axle. The ordinary rhythms of a child's life anchored her, but even jigsawed together, they couldn't hold off the rising current of danger. She avoided telling friends, kept the conversations at work light, deflecting inquiries with practiced ease. Daniel's email hung in her mind like a rot that could seep into every corner. She dreamed that night of hands reaching through the closet, of someone whispering her name, of the painting slashed and rolled like a body on the floor. She woke with the taste of copper in her mouth and a fierce, illuminative anger that made her move. She would not be intimidated. Not by a man who had built his life on domination and neat edges. Not by lawyers who saw life as a ledger. Not by the shadowy figures who might smell money and move in. She tightened the clasp on her bag and began making a list. Lawyer, secure storage, backup plan, someone to watch Liam if she had to disappear for a day. The list was her first act of defiance. Daniel wanted the painting. Let him try. She would bury the truth in legality and caution, and a stubborn mother's love that did not know how to give up. If the world wanted to play hardball, she could play harder. But as she set the list aside and pressed the phone to her ear to call Dr. Wells back, a new fear whispered, what if the enemies changed shape? What if the people who wanted the painting were not just former husbands and lawyers, but strangers with colder intentions? The painting had become a beacon, and beacons attract all kinds of ships, some that will rescue you and some that will sink you. She slept badly, the image of Daniel's smirk flashing through her dreams. When the sun rose, she was already moving. She would not hand him the canvas. She would not let his money and ego and legal maneuvers determine what happened to her life. But she also knew the truth. The painting had turned the world to a smaller, sharper place, and in that new landscape, she'd have to learn how to hide and to fight. The fight began now. She made the calls, wrote the emails, and waited. Outside, the city hummed oblivious, while inside the apartment a fragile peace teetered on the edge of collapse. The painting sat in the closet like a sleeping animal, and Sarah could not help but wonder how long it would sleep before the predators circled in for the kill. When the night came, it brought with it a different kind of silence, the loaded quiet that smelled of danger and the unknown. She locked the doors, checked them twice, and for the first time in months did not sleep on the couch. She slept in the bed, with Liam pressed at her side, and the painting hidden in the closet, as if that act of concealment might be enough to save them. The reality was simpler and harsher. It might not be enough. Returning from an exhausting double shift at the diner, the building's hallway light seemed dimmer than usual, the kind that cast long slashes of shadow. The door to her apartment stood ajar, a thin wedge of darkness slanted from inside. Adrenaline slammed into her gut, with the kind of force that made her mouth go dry. She pushed the door inward and stepped inside, calling Liam's name in a voice that did not want to betray panic. From the bedroom came the soft rattle of him turning over, the small snore of a child who had fallen asleep mid-dream. Relief surged, but it was swift and brittle. The closet door yawned open, the blankets that had covered the painting pooled on the floor in a careless heap. The canvas itself leaned against the wall where she'd left it. No, it wasn't where she'd left it. It stood at an angle, the frame shifted, the bottom corner exposed. Someone had been in her home. Someone had touched what she protected. Her hands went cold. She felt suddenly very small. The police were polite but uninterested. Probably a failed break-in, the officer said, tapping at his notepad without looking up. They take what's easy and move on. He suggested she reinforce her locks and maybe invest in a cheap alarm. He left with a brochure. His dismissal felt like a slap. She called Dr. Wells on her shaking cell, voice low and urgent. He was immediate, practical, firm. "You have to move it," he said. "I know a secure storage facility. It's expensive, but it's the safest option right now. Don't take it to the gallery. Don't let anyone come to the apartment. Go now." She wrapped the painting in sheets, her hands fumbling, and slid it into the back seat of her car. As she hit the street, headlights bleared behind her, close and deliberate. The sensation of being watched crawled up the back of her neck like ice. Her heart drummed in her throat as she drove, weaving through streets, checking mirrors, taking odd turns. She thought she saw the same set of headlights behind her for blocks. Then they were gone, then back, a shadowy tail that made the hairs on her arms rise. She took the long way to the storage facility, drove through a part of town that heaved with late-night life, and finally pulled into a brightly lit, security-gated compound where a man in a fluorescent vest met her and led them to a padlocked unit. She paid with shaking hands, signed the forms, and watched as the painting was carried inside and the heavy door clanged shut. For a moment, relief flooded her, raw and bright. The painting was locked away behind steel and cinder block. She brushed a hand over the canvas over the top of the blanket, where the woman with the basket lay sleeping, and felt absurdly maternal. But as she turned to leave, she saw a figure across the lot at the other end, someone standing in the shadow of a light pole, watching. By the time she blinked, he was gone. She drove home with her heart a tireless drum, a new wariness settling into her bones. Whoever had been in her apartment knew more than she did. Whoever had followed her to storage had motive and patience and resources. Daniel had the means, strangers had the cruelty. The painting had become a beacon, and people were circling. She closed the door of the apartment behind her that night, like a woman holding a thin line between what she had and what might be taken. The police had given her sympathy, but no solutions. Dr. Wells had given her a temporary sanctuary. Eleanor had given her a valuation and a warning. And Daniel had given her an enemy. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed while Liam slept, the weight of recent hours pressing in. She thought about the small woman in the painting and the way her eyes had looked almost alive when Eleanor had examined them. The thought brought her sorrow and fierce protectiveness at once. Whatever this painting was, whether salvation, talisman, or curse, it belonged to her now. She would guard it with everything she had. But guarding it meant more than locking it away. It meant learning who she could trust, who would trade her loyalty for a cut, who might sell a secret for a drink. It meant stepping into a world of whispered deals and polished danger, of men in suits and men in shadows. It meant, perhaps, bringing others into her fight, people like Dr. Wells and Eleanor, people who cared for art more than for profit, people who might see, as she did, that this canvas was not merely an object but a lifeline. The night stretched, black and anxious. Outside, somewhere, headlights moved like hungry beetles. Inside, Sarah lay awake, listening to the building settle and to her own pulse. She had taken a step toward safety, but the step only led her deeper into a place where nothing could be simple. The painting slept in the steel womb of a storage unit, and Sarah knew it would not be long before the world learned of its heartbeat. At the storage facility, Sarah felt as though she were being asked to sign away a part of herself. The clipboard trembled in her hands as she filled in her name and phone number on the dotted lines, each stroke of the pen feeling heavier than it should have. Carla, the manager, was a stern woman with square shoulders and the kind of no-nonsense gaze that made you believe her when she said, "We take security seriously here." She tapped the counter with her pen, her voice steady, climate-controlled, keycard entry, 24-hour surveillance, motion detectors in every aisle. Once it's in here, it won't move unless you decide to move it. Sarah wanted to believe her. She wanted to take comfort in the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, the scent of steel and concrete that filled the air, the heavy clank of the vault door echoing like the promise of safety. But as she slid the canvas into its new resting place, a pang twisted in her chest. It felt like leaving Liam behind, like surrendering a part of her life to strangers. The painting wasn't just paint and canvas anymore. It had become proof that she wasn't broken, that Daniel hadn't stripped her down to nothing. It was her son's future, her survival stitched into brushstrokes. Letting it out of her sight made her feel bare. Carla locked the vault, her hands moving with brisk confidence. "There," she said simply. "Safer here than anywhere else." On the drive home, Sarah gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles burned. The car felt empty without the painting in the back seat, the absence of its presence gnawing at her. Yet a strange lightness pressed against her too. For the first time in weeks, she didn't have to glance in the rearview mirror, terrified of headlights that followed too long. She didn't have to lie awake listening for footsteps outside her door. The painting was safe for now, but the relief was fragile, mixed with exposure. Without it in her arms, she felt vulnerable, as though her shield had been stripped away. She was left with nothing but herself, her son, and the belief that maybe she could fight after all. That night, she stayed up late at the kitchen table, papers spread out before her. Divorce decrees, appraisal notes, Eleanor's card, the crumpled email from Daniel still printed and folded. She could no longer afford to be reactive, waiting for the next blow. She had to move strategically, or else Daniel and whoever else might be circling would devour her. Through a women's shelter she had once donated to during better days, Sarah found the name of a pro bono lawyer who specialized in protecting women from predatory ex-spouses. His name was Michael Levin, a wiry man with patient eyes and a voice like gravel worn smooth by years of battles in family court. He met her at his cramped office, with walls lined in overstuffed file cabinets and coffee rings staining the wood of his desk. "Tell me everything," he said, steepling his fingers. And she did. She spoke of Daniel's email, his lawyer's threats, the attempted break-in, the appraisal, the whispers of Elena Volkov, the painting now locked away behind steel doors. She expected disbelief, or worse, judgment. Instead, Michael only nodded, scribbling notes with calm efficiency. "He'll try to reopen the settlement," he said finally. "Claim omission, maybe fraud. But the law's on your side if we document carefully. Start a trail now, prove chain of custody, prove it was dismissed as worthless property at the time of the divorce. And if he pushes harder, we counterclaim with financial abuse. You're not defenseless, Sarah." The words cracked something in her chest. For years, she had felt cornered, small, helpless. Now, someone was telling her she had power, if she was willing to use it. For the first time in years, she felt she wasn't alone. Weeks blurred into a strange rhythm, the days split between her shifts at the diner, Liam's school routines, and meetings with Michael to build their case. The painting slept in its steel cocoon, far from her sight, but its weight never left her shoulders. When the call finally came, it was as though her entire body forgot how to breathe. She nearly dropped the phone when Eleanor Grant's voice came through, crisp and deliberate. "Miss Hayes, I have news." Sarah pressed the phone tight to her ear, her heart pounding so violently she thought Eleanor might hear it through the line. "What is it?" There was a pause, and then the words that would change her life forever. "The painting has been authenticated by international experts. There is no doubt. It is a genuine Elena Volkov." Sarah sank into the nearest chair, her knees giving way, tears springing instantly to her eyes. Her throat closed around a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She couldn't speak, could barely even breathe as Eleanor's voice continued, calm but warm. "Congratulations, Miss Hayes. You own one of the most important rediscovered works of Russian émigré art." The tears spilled freely now, hot and relentless, dripping onto her lap as she covered her face with her free hand. Years of humiliation, of being dismissed and diminished, of scraping coins together while Daniel paraded his wealth, it all broke open in that moment. She wept not just for relief but for vindication, for proof that she had not been discarded to nothing. Eleanor explained the details, her voice steady against Sarah's gasping silence. The brushwork had been compared to Volkov's surviving studies. The pigments matched those available only in late 19th century Europe. The initials aligned perfectly with her known sketch signatures. Independent panels from 2 major European museums had signed off on the findings. There was no longer any question. "International museums will be interested," Eleanor said. "So will private collectors. The estimated auction value has risen possibly as high as $7 million. $7 million. The number was surreal, impossible, something Sarah's mind could not wrap itself around. She laughed through her tears, the sound wild, shaky, half hysterical. "7 million?" she repeated, as though saying it aloud might anchor it in reality. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed gently. "This is life-changing, Miss Hayes. But also dangerous. Handle it carefully." Sarah pressed the phone to her chest after the call ended, rocking back and forth in the chair like a woman trying to cradle the weight of a miracle. She thought of Liam, of the inhaler on his nightstand, of the worn shoes by the door. She thought of the landlord's notice, the pile of unpaid bills, the humiliation of handing over food stamps at the grocery store. And then she thought of Daniel's smirk, his email dripping with entitlement, his lawyer's voice like a blade. All of it, every moment of struggle, had led here to this. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, her body trembling with a release so fierce it left her dizzy. She whispered to the empty apartment, to the ghosts of the past that had haunted her, "You didn't destroy me, you never did." For years, she had been dismissed, belittled, stripped of dignity. And now, a single painting, dismissed as worthless, was about to change everything. The calls began as whispers, and quickly turned into a storm. Sarah's phone seemed to light up with unknown numbers every day, emails flooding her inbox with polite greetings, formal letterheads, and names she had only ever seen in glossy magazines. Sotheby's, Christie's, smaller European firms with elegant logos and a tone of hushed urgency. All of them wanted the same thing: to represent her, to shepherd the painting into an auction house where it would be displayed under blazing lights, fought over by the world's wealthiest collectors. They painted pictures of prestige, of champagne receptions, of bidders raising paddles in a frenzy. They promised her security, fame, financial freedom. And yet, every message, every call only made her chest tighten. One house went further than the others. They offered her an advance against the painting's future auction price, a number so large Sarah nearly dropped her phone when she heard it. With that check alone, she could pay every debt, move Liam into a real home, fill their refrigerator until it burst, maybe even take a breath, without the weight of fear pressing down. The number hovered in her mind for days, following her through the grind of diner shifts, through the quiet nights when Liam coughed in his sleep, through the mornings when she packed his modest lunch with a knot in her throat. But something stopped her each time she thought of signing the papers. The money was intoxicating, but the painting had become more than currency. It was proof she had survived, proof Daniel hadn't stripped her down to ash. It wasn't just a transaction, it was vindication, a legacy, a reminder that beauty could survive fires, wars, even betrayal. She looked at the image of the small woman in the painting, the sorrow in her eyes, and felt as though she was being asked to betray something larger than herself if she let it go too quickly. Liam saw it too. Children have a way of noticing what adults try to bury. One night, as they ate boxed macaroni at the kitchen table, he asked in his quiet way, "Mom, if we sell it, what happens to her?" "To who?" she asked, startled. "To the lady," he said, pointing to the photograph of the painting Eleanor had sent for her records. "The one with the basket. She looks like she's waiting for something. Maybe it's not about money. Maybe it's about keeping her safe. Like you kept me safe." The words pierced Sarah deeper than anything the auction houses had said. She looked at her son, his eyes serious, his face still holding the softness of childhood, and felt tears sting the back of her eyes. His perspective made her hesitation clearer. It wasn't only about bills or debts, it was about what the painting represented, what it carried. Perhaps keeping it safe meant more than selling it to the highest bidder. But the offers kept coming, the promises louder, the temptation sharper. She stood at a crossroads between survival and meaning, between the quick escape of money and the long burden of legacy. Each time she stared at the documents waiting on her counter, she thought of Daniel's sneer, of the pawn shop clerk's smirk, of every person who had looked at her and seen nothing of worth. This painting had proven them wrong. If she sold it too quickly, she feared she might feel as though she had sold her own story as well. The choice pressed closer every day, and Sarah knew she couldn't stall forever. But before she could decide, Daniel made his next move. The letter arrived in the mail, thick with legal weight, stamped with authority that made Sarah's heart seize before she even opened it. Daniel's lawyer had filed an emergency petition, claiming the painting had been concealed during the divorce and therefore remained marital property. Sarah's hands shook as she read the words, her breath coming shallow and sharp. Concealed. Fraud. Omission. They had twisted the story into something dangerous, a noose tightening around her neck. She called Michael immediately, her voice breaking. He told her to come in. By the time she sat in his office with Eleanor beside her, her chest felt like it might collapse. But their calm steadied her. Michael leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and said, "He's playing his last card. Don't panic. We have what we need." Eleanor opened her folder, spreading out photographs, appraisal notes, and witness statements. Daniel dismissed the painting openly during the divorce. There are court records of him mocking it, of him calling it worthless. We have testimony from Mrs. Holloway about how it was left to gather dust in the basement. We'll make it clear. He forfeited any claim when he rejected it outright. The day of the hearing, Sarah's stomach churned so violently she thought she might faint before she even stepped into the courthouse. Liam clutched her hand, his small fingers grounding her, reminding her of why she was here. She walked in trembling, but she walked in. Daniel sat across from her, his expression smug, his lawyer whispering in his ear. His smirk was infuriatingly familiar, the same one he had worn during the divorce, during every argument, every dismissal. But this time, something inside Sarah hardened. She would not wilt. The proceedings dragged like hours through molasses. Daniel's lawyer painted a picture of omission, of hidden value, of Sarah cunningly clutching a treasure she had concealed. But when Michael rose, his voice was clear, unshakable. He recited the court transcripts, the exact words Daniel had used when he sneered at the painting, calling it junk. He presented witness statements that confirmed its neglect, the dust, the years of abandonment. Eleanor's testimony struck the hardest her professional authority, slicing through Daniel's claims like glass. When the judge finally spoke, Sarah gripped Liam's hand so tightly he winced. The words came steady and final. The painting was hers, solely and irrevocably. Daniel had dismissed it, rejected it, and in doing so, had forfeited any interest. The petition was denied. The smirk slid from Daniel's face like paint melting off a wall. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened, and fury burned in his eyes where arrogance had once gleamed. Sarah met his gaze, not with triumph, but with something fiercer. Defiance, dignity, survival. For once, she was not the one walking out diminished. She walked out with her head high, Liam's laughter ringing in her ears as he whispered, "We won, Mom. We really won." The courthouse doors swung open to the cold air, but Sarah felt only warmth. She had stared her past in the face and refused to bow. Daniel's fury no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had fought, and she had not been broken. She held her son's hand in one and her future in the other, and for the first time she truly believed she could hold both. News travels fast in a small town. Faster still when the story has the kind of shimmer people can't ignore. It began with a short piece in the local paper, tucked between a city council update and a high school football recap. Local woman discovers masterpiece in divorce settlement. Within a week, it spread to the front page, complete with a photograph of Sarah standing outside the diner in her uniform, her expression both proud and overwhelmed. They called her the woman with the Volkov, as if her name had merged with the painting, her identity fused with its discovery. Soon strangers were drifting into the diner not for coffee or pie but to catch a glimpse of her, to see the woman who had unearthed art history from the dust of her basement. The same neighbors who had once looked at her with pity, whispering about her failed marriage, now stopped her with warm smiles and eager questions. People who had avoided her in the grocery store now sought her out at the post office, leaning close to say, "We always knew you were stronger than he gave you credit for." Sarah accepted the praise with a polite nod. But inside she couldn't help but remember how invisible she had been before, how those same voices had been silent when she struggled. Admiration came laced with irony, but it was admiration nonetheless, and it stirred something inside her. She thought she'd lost the reminder that she mattered, that her story mattered. The diner became its own stage. Strangers sat at the counter sipping coffee, their eyes drifting to her as if she were the attraction instead of the menu. Some left notes of encouragement tucked under their receipts. A tourist asked for a selfie, the first time anyone had ever pointed a camera at her without her ex-husband standing front and center. Sarah smiled, though wariness tugged at her. Fame, even the small-town kind, had sharp edges. She kept her circle tight, confiding only in Mrs. Holloway, Dr. Wells, and Eleanor, the three people who had been there from the start. Everyone else she met with warmth but caution. She tried to shield Liam from the noise, insisting on regular routines, school, homework, bedtime stories. He was proud of her. She could see it in the way he held his head a little higher when classmates asked about the painting, but she knew the attention could confuse him too. At night, she reminded him softly, "You're the most important thing. Not the painting. Always you." The fame didn't pay bills. The lights still flickered in the apartment, the rent still loomed, and she still came home from the diner with aching feet. But it gave her something she hadn't had in years, a sense of being seen, not just as Daniel's discarded wife, or the quiet waitress behind the counter, but as herself. People asked her opinion, wanted her story. It wasn't money, but it was dignity, and it reminded her that she was not, and had never been, nothing. Yet admiration carried scrutiny. Rumors sprouted about the painting's security, about what she might do with the money. People speculated in hushed voices. Would she leave town, buy a mansion, reinvent herself? Sarah ignored them. She learned to smile, to deflect, to keep her plans close. Trust was a scarce currency, and she spent it carefully. What mattered most was Liam's safety and her own steady resolve. The rest was noise. And so, while the town marveled, Sarah kept her head down, her feet grounded, her circle small. Fame might have pulled her into the light, but it hadn't changed her truth. She was still a mother fighting for a future, a woman holding on to her dignity, a survivor turning ashes into something that finally glittered. The auction house was nothing like the diner, nothing like the courthouse, nothing like any place Sarah had ever walked into. The air vibrated with anticipation, the buzz of wealth and hunger. Rows of chairs filled with men in suits, women in glittering jewelry, and representatives from museums who whispered in low voices as they eyed the stage. The painting, her painting, hung under perfect lighting, its sorrowful figure glowing as if alive. Sarah sat at the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, Liam's small fingers woven into hers. Her heart hammered so hard she felt it in her throat. The auctioneer wasted no time. His voice rang out brisk and confident. "We'll begin the bidding at $1 million. A paddle rose instantly. Then another. The numbers climbed with dizzying speed. 2 million. 3. Sarah's breath hitched. 4 million. 5. The air grew electric, every call sharper than the last. Liam squeezed her hand, his eyes wide, his lips parted in awe. Sarah could hardly breathe, hardly comprehend the whirlwind of numbers flying through the room. 6 million. The paddles waved, the voices firm, the energy fevered. She felt herself slipping outside her body, as though she were watching from somewhere above, a spectator to her own fate. The sorrowful woman in the painting looked down from the stage, her eyes steady, her basket clasped, as though she knew all along she was meant to be here, to be seen, to be valued. 7 million. The crowd murmured, tension sharp, and then 8 million. 8.3 million, the auctioneer declared, his gavel hovering. "Do I have any further bids?" Silence fell, thick and heavy, before the gavel came down with a crack that seemed to shake the room. "Sold?" Gasps rippled, a wave of astonishment cresting and breaking around her. The applause was polite but fervent, a recognition of history as much as money. Sarah sat frozen, her mind reeling. Eleanor leaned close, her hand firm on Sarah's shoulder, her voice a whisper that cut through the chaos. "It's yours. You've done it." Sarah's face crumpled, tears spilling freely. She clutched Liam to her, her sobs breaking open the years of silence, the weight of humiliation, the fear that had lived in her bones. She wept openly, not caring who saw, not caring about the strangers with their jewels and their wealth. The gavel had freed her. They were free. Free from debt, free from Daniel's shadow, free from fear. Liam hugged her fiercely, his little arms around her neck, his voice muffled but sure. "We're okay now, Mom. We're really okay." Sarah nodded through her tears, her chest swelling with a feeling she hadn't known in years' peace. The painting had been born of sorrow, abandoned to dust, mocked as worthless. But it had survived, and so had she. And now, both of them were finally, truly seen. The house was nothing like the sprawling suburban one she had once shared with Daniel, but that was precisely what made it perfect. It wasn't grand or ostentatious, but modest, tucked on a quiet street lined with maple trees, whose branches arched like guardians overhead. For Sarah, its charm was in its simplicity: a porch with space for a swing, a kitchen that smelled faintly of pine from the freshly scrubbed cabinets, 2 bedrooms upstairs where Liam could scatter his toys without fear of disapproval, and a patch of yard that promised springtime flowers. She hadn't bought the biggest or flashiest place her newfound fortune could afford. She had chosen carefully, guided by Eleanor's steady advice. The first night there, Liam ran from room to room with the kind of joy she hadn't seen in him for years, his laughter bouncing off freshly painted walls. "This is ours?" he kept asking, as though he needed to hear it confirmed again and again. Sarah followed him, nodding, tears threatening as she watched him spin in circles on the bare hardwood floor, free in a way that only children who've known fear can be when safety finally surrounds them. She didn't splurge on gilded furniture or designer brands. What she indulged in was stability: a refrigerator that was full, not rationed; closets with clothes bought new, not scavenged from thrift stores under pressure; bookshelves lined with novels and history books and picture stories for Liam, the scent of fresh pages filling their evenings; a desk where she could keep bills neatly sorted, no longer panicked piles of overdue notices. The small things became luxuries, and each one stitched her life back together in quiet, powerful ways. Her gratitude manifested in action. She donated a portion of the sale to women's shelters, slipping into their offices with no fanfare, only quiet insistence that the money be used to help women like her, women caught in the vice of controlling husbands and relentless courts. She knew what it was to feel erased, and she wanted to give others the chance to reclaim themselves. She invested wisely, letting Eleanor connect her with financial advisors who treated her with a respect that still startled her. College funds for Liam were set aside, bonds purchased, accounts balanced. She listened carefully, asked questions she might once have been afraid to ask, and left each meeting with her head a little higher. She was no longer the woman afraid of overdue fees. She was someone with a future. Still, she didn't want to forget what had led her there. She ordered a high-quality reproduction of the Volkov and hung it in the living room above the mantel. Visitors sometimes mistook it for the original, but Sarah never corrected them with pride or arrogance. To her, it wasn't about flaunting value, it was about remembering. That woman in the painting, once a symbol of sorrow, had carried Sarah out of the ashes. Every time she passed it, she was reminded: survival could bloom into triumph. On weekends, she planted flowers in the small garden bed, dirt under her nails, sun on her back, while Liam chased fireflies in the twilight. In those quiet moments, she realized her wealth wasn't about revenge against Daniel, nor the thrill of proving him wrong. It was about dignity reclaimed, about creating a world where her son could grow without fear, where she could breathe without the weight of shame. It was about healing, not showing off. Her life no longer felt like scraps handed to her. It was hers, wholly and finally. The evening was quiet, the kind of calm that felt earned rather than accidental. Sarah sat on the couch with Liam curled against her side, their eyes drawn to the painting hanging above the mantel. The reproduction was flawless, each brushstroke carefully preserved, the sorrowful woman forever frozen in her eternal walk across a landscape of muted beauty. Liam's voice, soft but curious, broke the silence. "Mom," he said, his head tilting as he studied the figure, "do you think the lady in the picture is still sad?" Sarah looked at it with him, letting her gaze linger on the painted eyes. She had once seen nothing but grief there, the kind that pierced her on her darkest nights, reflecting her own despair back at her. But now, something had shifted. The eyes seemed softer, gentler. The mouth, once heavy with sorrow, now carried a quiet calm. Perhaps it was only her own perspective that had changed, but she smiled, feeling the truth of it. "No, sweetheart," she murmured, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "I think she's at peace now, just like us." Liam nestled closer into her side, his warmth grounding her, his small hand clutching hers with the trust only a child could give. The gratitude that surged in her chest was overwhelming, a tide that pressed tears into her eyes. She thought back to the courtroom where she had stood humiliated, to the pawn shop clerk who had smirked at her desperation, to Daniel's sneer when he shoved the painting into her hands. What began as his cruelest insult had become her greatest redemption. The painting had given her more than wealth. It had given her back herself. It had proven that what others discarded could still hold immeasurable value, that survival could be more than just endurance. It could become victory. In its cracked varnish and fading colors, she had found not just money but a reminder that she was never worthless, never broken beyond repair. Sarah Hayes, once humiliated and discarded, now sat in her own home with her son safe beside her. She was stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. She had risen, and she had no intention of ever falling back into the shadows of doubt again. She pressed a kiss to Liam's hair, whispering into the stillness a vow that was more to herself than to him. "Never again will I doubt my worth." The woman in the painting watched silently from her place above the mantel, her sorrow transmuted into serenity, a quiet witness to the journey that had carried Sarah from despair to triumph. And in that soft, sacred moment, mother and son sat together in the glow of their new beginning, their story no longer one of survival alone but of reclamation, dignity, and a future filled with light. If you were inspired by Sarah's journey from heartbreak to triumph, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments what part of her story moved you the most. And make sure you stay tuned, because tomorrow's story will leave you absolutely speechless.